Every Sunday after church, they vanished. My husband and my son, always together, always secretive. I asked where they went. They said it was nothing. But last Sunday, I followed them. In today's story, you'll uncover a hidden truth that shattered a marriage, shook a family, and exposed a secret buried for decades. You'll learn how a quiet, loving wife discovered that the man she'd spent her life with and the son she raised were both tied to a past she was never meant to know. Stay with me until the end, because what started as a simple Sunday routine turned into the biggest betrayal of my life. Every Sunday, it was the same. We'd sit together in the second pew from the front, me, my husband Richard, and our son Daniel. Church had always been a sacred routine for us. The pastor's voice, the hum of the choir, the quiet way Richard held my hand during prayer, it gave me comfort. It made me feel like we were still a family rooted in something pure. But for the last 6 months, something had changed. As soon as the service ended, Richard would nudge Daniel. They'd exchange a look. A quiet one, like a code. Then he'd kiss my cheek, say, "We're just grabbing a coffee," and they'd walk off together. No invitation. No explanation. At first, I didn't think much of it. A father and son bonding, it felt normal. Sweet, even. But then it became too regular. Every Sunday. No exceptions. And each time they returned, they came back just a little more secretive. Richard stopped telling me where they went. Daniel stopped talking about his weekends altogether. I tried not to overthink it. I told myself it was probably harmless. Maybe they were just reconnecting. Daniel had moved back home after college, and I knew he and his father hadn't always been close. So I let it go. But my heart wouldn't rest. There were little things. The way Richard started checking his phone more often, even during dinner. The faint scent of perfume on Daniel's jacket one evening when he hugged me goodbye. When I asked about it, he just smiled and said it must have come from a friend. And still, every Sunday, they left. Together. Right after church. Like clockwork. Then came last Sunday. The morning felt colder than usual, even though the sun was out. I watched them from the corner of my eye as we stood for the final hymn. Richard looked at his watch twice. Daniel barely glanced at me. When service ended, they did what they always did. A quick goodbye, a vague excuse, and off they went. But this time, I followed them. I didn't know what I expected to find. Maybe I thought they were just grabbing lunch somewhere or catching a game. Something innocent. Something that would make me feel silly for ever doubting them. I waited a few minutes before leaving the church, slipping into my car and trailing behind theirs. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. My breath felt tight in my chest. They didn't go to a coffee shop. They didn't go to the sports bar Daniel used to like. They drove to a quiet part of town, the kind of place people go when they don't want to be found. A little cafe tucked between 2 antique stores, almost hidden behind ivy-covered brick walls. I parked across the street. I stayed in my car. Through the cafe's wide front window, I saw them sit at a corner table. And then I saw the 2 women already waiting there. From across the street, I could see everything clearly. Richard leaned in first, smiling, not the small, polite smile he gave to neighbors or church friends. No, this smile was softer, familiar, the kind of smile you give to someone you've missed, someone you know too well. Then came the shock that tightened every muscle in my body. The woman sitting across from him, she stood up to hug him. She looked about my age. Slightly younger, maybe. Chestnut hair pulled back in a loose bun, sunglasses perched on her head. There was something graceful about the way she moved, like she wasn't rushing anything. She held onto Richard just a second longer than I liked. Daniel was smiling too. He leaned in and hugged her like he'd done it before, like she wasn't a stranger. And then the second woman stood up. This one was younger. Much younger. Her long, honey blonde hair fell over her shoulders, and she wore a pale blue sweater that made her look softer somehow, like someone raised on kindness and open spaces. Daniel hugged her too, and I swear, I saw her blush. They all sat down together, laughing, comfortable. I watched Richard reach across the table, his hand brushing the older woman's as he said something that made her smile again. Not a casual smile, a private one. The kind of smile that holds memory, that carries weight. That's when it hit me. This wasn't some random meeting. This wasn't a father and son outing. This was planned, regular, familiar. I stared at the younger girl and tried to piece it together. Was she Daniel's girlfriend? A family friend? And who was this woman that had Richard looking at her like he'd found something he'd lost a long time ago? For a moment, I couldn't move. I just sat there, hands clutching the steering wheel, heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every thought in my head. Then Richard reached into his jacket, pulled out a small notebook, and passed it across the table to the older woman. She laughed again, touched his hand. He didn't pull away. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. For days, the image of Richard with her, Evelyn, I realized, after I saw the name on the notebook, haunted me. The way he touched her hand. The way they shared private smiles. The way Daniel looked so comfortable, like he knew them both so well. It was as if they had all been part of something for a long time, something I had no place in. I had to know more. I needed to understand why none of this had ever been mentioned. So I started looking. I went through the old family albums first, ones I hadn't touched in years. Richard and I had always kept them tucked away, memories of our youth and early years together. I flipped through the pages, searching for anything that might explain why Richard was so familiar with Evelyn. And there it was. A photo from decades ago, taken at a party when Richard and I were still newly married. There, standing close together with their arms around each other, were Richard and Evelyn. Young, carefree. I almost couldn't believe my eyes. Evelyn looked different then, so much younger. But the way she smiled at Richard, it was clear. They were more than just friends. They were in love. My hands trembled as I traced the photo with my finger. What had happened to them? Why had they separated? I had never asked Richard about his past love. I hadn't even known her name until now. Maybe I should have. But we had our own life, our own history, and I never thought it mattered. I needed to know how the story ended. How they had parted. Was it mutual? Or was there more to it? Why didn't Richard ever mention her? I spent the next few days searching through old papers and boxes, anything I could find that might give me a glimpse into their past. It was in one of those boxes, tucked beneath a pile of forgotten bills, that I found a letter. It was yellowed with age, the ink fading, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Richard's. The letter was addressed to Evelyn. The words were soft, full of longing, but there was also something heavy beneath them. Something that hinted at an ending that neither of them had wanted. I never wanted to hurt you, Evelyn. But sometimes we have to make choices that we don't want to make. Our families are demanding, and we're caught in the middle. I wish it could be different, but I need to be here. For my family. I hope you understand. I read the letter over and over, each time with a heavier heart. It didn't sound like a simple goodbye. It sounded like something was left unsaid. Something unresolved. Evelyn must have been heartbroken, but Richard, why had he never mentioned this to me? Why had he carried this secret for so long? As I sat there, staring at the letter, I realized something I hadn't before. This wasn't just about Richard reconnecting with his past. This was about me, about everything I thought I knew about him and the life we'd built. If there had been so much he hadn't told me, what else was I missing? And then there was Daniel. My son. He had no idea what he had stepped into, did he? He had no idea that the woman he was now involved with, Chloe, was the daughter of Richard's first love. How long had they known each other? How deep was this connection? I had so many questions, but I couldn't ask them all at once. I needed to piece this together carefully, one piece at a time. If I confronted Richard now, I wasn't sure what I'd find. Would he be honest? Or would he lie to cover up what had happened years ago? But one thing was clear. The past was still alive in this family. And it was far from over. I couldn't take it anymore. The weight of everything I had uncovered was too much to carry around in silence. I needed answers, and I needed them now. So I waited. Richard came home late that evening, as he always did, but this time, I wasn't going to let it go. The house was quiet. Daniel was in his room, probably working on his computer, unaware of what was about to unfold. I could feel my heart racing as Richard hung up his coat and walked into the kitchen. "Hey," he said casually, like everything was normal. I couldn't meet his eyes. Not yet. I had to steady myself. I had to sound calm, even though every nerve in my body was screaming. "Richard," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I need to talk to you." He paused. That same slight shift in his demeanor. The way his eyes darted away for a second, like he knew what was coming. I watched him take a deep breath, a man who had faced hard conversations before but always seemed to avoid them. He sat down at the kitchen table, running a hand through his hair. "What's on your mind? Why didn't you tell me about Evelyn?" I asked, finally looking him in the eye. The question hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Richard's face stiffened. For a moment, he didn't answer, just stared at me like he was calculating how much to reveal. "I didn't think it mattered," he said, almost too quickly. "It was a long time ago, Laura. Before we even met." I could feel the lie curling in his words. It was too practiced, too rehearsed. "But it matters now, doesn't it?" I pushed. "It matters when you're meeting her every Sunday. When you're sitting across from her in a cafe like it's nothing. It matters when you've been hiding it from me for months." He shifted in his chair, his hand gripping the edge of the table. "I'm not hiding anything, Laura. It's not like that. It's just, we're reconnecting. She's an old friend, and I've been helping her with some personal things. It's not what you think." I wanted to believe him. I really did, but I could hear the cracks in his voice, the way he struggled to keep his calm. I knew there was more, but he wasn't ready to tell me yet. "Helping her with personal things?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Richard, we've been married for over 20 years. I deserve to know what's going on. You're meeting her every Sunday. That's not just casual. What are you not telling me?" He finally looked at me, his face softening. "It's complicated, Laura. I can't explain it all right now. I need you to trust me. Trust you." I laughed bitterly, the words tasting foreign in my mouth. "You've been lying to me. You've been lying to both of us." His face darkened. "That's not fair. I didn't lie, I just didn't want to bring up the past. It's over. It was over a long time ago." I could hear the hesitation in his voice, the underlying guilt he wasn't willing to admit. "Then why are you meeting her?" I pressed, my voice shaking now. "Why are you still seeing her every week? And why didn't you tell me about her before? About their history?" Richard stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply as if trying to calm himself. "It's not about you, Laura. It's about me, about my past. Things I've never talked about because I didn't want to hurt you." I felt the weight of those words, but they didn't make the anger go away. Instead, they made it worse. Because if it wasn't about me, then why was I being kept in the dark? Why did I have to discover this on my own? "I'm not stupid, Richard," I said quietly, my voice breaking. "I know there's more. You've been seeing her for weeks, and Daniel. Daniel has no idea what's going on, does he?" Richard didn't respond. He just stared at me, his eyes tired, as if he had no more answers left to give. I swallowed the lump in my throat, the realization that maybe he didn't want to share it with me. Maybe after all these years, he was still keeping pieces of himself hidden, and the more I dug, the further he pulled away. "I want to understand," I whispered, "but you have to tell me the truth." He shook his head, turning away. "I don't think I can do that, Laura. Not yet. It's not the right time." And with that, he walked out of the room, leaving me standing there alone with the truth I hadn't wanted to face. The days that followed were heavy, like I was walking through thick fog. Richard had withdrawn further into himself, his eyes avoiding mine whenever he passed through the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something deeper than just Evelyn and their hidden meetings. Then, one afternoon, Daniel and I were alone in the kitchen. He was making a sandwich, his focus on the bread and the knife, his usual distracted self. But there was a tension in the air, a crackling energy that told me something was off. I stood at the counter, silently watching him. The house was still, too still. It was rare for us to be alone like this, and for the first time in a long while, I found myself wanting to talk to him, not as a mother, but as someone who needed answers. "Daniel," I said, my voice quiet, "is there something you need to tell me?" He paused, the knife still in his hand. For a moment, I thought he hadn't heard me, but then he set the knife down and looked at me, his expression unreadable. "About what?" he asked, his tone casual, but there was a hesitation in his eyes. A flicker of something that made my stomach churn. "About what's been happening lately," I pressed. "About your father and Evelyn. About everything." Daniel's face changed in that instant. His shoulders tensed, and he shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, his gaze dropping to the counter. I knew then that he knew more than he was letting on. I could see it in his eyes, the guilt, the uncertainty. He was hiding something from me, something that tied him to this mess. "Don't lie to me, Daniel," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I saw you at the cafe with them." He froze, his body stiffening as if he'd been caught in a trap. I watched him swallow hard, his hands clenching into fists on the counter. "I didn't want you to know," he whispered, his voice low, almost ashamed. "I didn't know how to tell you." "Tell me what, Daniel?" I asked, my heart racing. "What are you involved in? Why didn't you tell me?" He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply. "It's not what you think, Mom. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. It just did. Just did." I repeated, feeling a wave of confusion and anger wash over me. "What do you mean? What's going on between you and her?" Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, like he was trying to find the right words. When he opened them again, I saw the truth in them, even though he tried to hide it. "It's Chloe," he said softly. "Evelyn's daughter. I've been seeing her. We've been seeing each other for months now." I blinked, stunned into silence. Chloe, Richard's first love's daughter. The girl who had smiled so shyly at me across the table. The same girl who had blushed when Daniel touched her arm. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice trembling now. "Why didn't you tell your father?" This is so wrong, Daniel." "I know," he said, his face full of regret. "I didn't want to complicate things. I didn't want to hurt you or Dad, but I couldn't help how I felt. I thought it could stay secret, just between us. But it's harder than I thought." My mind was racing, trying to piece together everything. The hidden meetings, the secret smiles, the family connection I hadn't even known about. The betrayal ran deeper than I had imagined. It wasn't just Richard who had a past with Evelyn, it was my own son who had unknowingly stepped into a web of lies and history he didn't understand. "Do you know how wrong this is, Daniel?" I whispered, barely able to contain the hurt in my voice. This isn't just a casual fling. You're involved with her daughter. Your father's first love. Do you even understand the mess this is?" "I didn't plan it, Mom," he said, his voice cracking now. "It just happened. I didn't know what to do. I never meant to hurt you." I wanted to yell. I wanted to shake him and tell him how everything was falling apart. But I couldn't. I just stood there, the weight of everything pressing down on me. "Why didn't you come to me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with remorse. "I was scared, Mom. Scared of how you'd react. Scared that you'd hate me." I wanted to hold him, to tell him that I loved him no matter what, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I? How could I tell him that when everything felt like a betrayal? When my whole world had shifted beneath my feet? "Your father needs to know," I said, finally finding my voice again, though it felt so small. "You need to tell him, Daniel. This can't go on." You have to be honest with him, or none of this will ever make sense. He nodded slowly, his face pale, and I could tell he wasn't ready. But something had broken in him too. Something had shifted, and for the first time in a long while, he seemed like the boy I raised, the one who still cared about doing what was right, even if he didn't know how to fix everything. The air in the house had grown thick. Every corner of it seemed to hum with the unspoken words that lingered in the space between us. Richard hadn't said much since my conversation with Daniel, but I could feel him retreating further into himself. I wasn't sure if it was guilt or confusion or just the weight of everything crashing down at once. Either way, it was suffocating. Dinner was quiet that night. Daniel picked at his food, avoiding eye contact with either of us. Richard barely looked up from his plate, the silence stretching out longer than it ever had before. I could tell he was waiting for me to say something, but the words wouldn't come. I had tried to be patient with him. I had tried to give him the space to explain, but nothing ever came. He stayed distant, lost in his thoughts, and I knew there was more he wasn't telling me. As the days passed, it only got worse. The tension in the house was unbearable. I could feel the cracks forming, the foundation of our family slowly crumbling beneath the weight of all the secrets. Every glance Richard and Daniel exchanged felt like a silent battle, each one struggling to hold onto something they couldn't quite name. And then there were the Sundays. I had been trying to avoid them, trying to pretend that everything was normal, that things would eventually smooth over. But it was impossible. Every Sunday, like clockwork, Richard would leave after church, and I knew exactly where he was going. To Evelyn. To their shared past, their old wounds. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed to know. I needed answers. That Sunday, I decided to follow him. I couldn't just sit back and pretend everything was fine. I had to see it for myself. I had to know what they were doing, what they were talking about. I couldn't trust Richard anymore, not with everything I had learned. I watched him leave the house, his steps casual, like nothing was amiss. But the knot in my stomach tightened as I followed him from a distance, keeping my car just far enough behind so he wouldn't notice. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. He drove straight to the cafe again. The same place. The same routine. But this time, it wasn't just Evelyn waiting for him. Chloe was there too. I saw her, standing by the table, looking around nervously. My son's girlfriend. My heart sank as I watched them greet each other, exchanging familiar smiles. The way Daniel had smiled at her earlier. The way Richard had smiled at Evelyn. It all made sense now. Too much sense. I sat there in my car, watching them all interact. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could see it in the way they leaned in toward one another, the unspoken familiarity, the ease between them. And suddenly, I felt so out of place. Like I was the stranger in my own family. Daniel had known all along. He had been hiding it from me, just like his father. The two of them, wrapped up in this tangled mess of old loves and new secrets, all playing their parts without ever acknowledging what was really going on. But then something changed. Richard stood up abruptly, his expression darkening. He looked at Chloe for a long moment, as if deciding something. He said something to Evelyn, and she nodded, though there was a hesitation in her smile. It was too much. I couldn't stay hidden any longer. I couldn't watch them tear everything apart while I stood by. I stepped out of the car, my legs trembling as I walked toward the cafe. My heart raced in my chest, and the world seemed to move in slow motion as I approached the table. There they were, my husband, my son, and Evelyn, all sitting together like one big happy family. Like they had never left each other. Richard saw me first. His eyes widened in surprise, and for the first time in days, his face cracked. He looked guilty. Like he had been caught doing something wrong. "Laura," he said, his voice quiet. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer him. I couldn't. I just looked at Evelyn, the woman who had once been his world. And then at Chloe, the girl my son was now involved with. It felt like a betrayal I couldn't ignore any longer. "You've been meeting here every Sunday," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of hurt and anger. "All of you. Behind my back." There was a moment of silence as everyone at the table seemed to hold their breath. Richard opened his mouth to say something, but I didn't let him. I had waited long enough for answers. "You never thought to tell me, Richard? You never thought to tell me about her." I gestured to Evelyn, then to Chloe. "About their connection to you, to our son?" Evelyn looked down, her hands clasped together. She didn't speak, but her silence said everything. It was a silence that felt heavy, like a secret shared between them all that had never been spoken aloud. Daniel, who had been sitting there like a ghost, finally spoke up. "Mom, please. It's not like you think." His voice was quiet, almost apologetic, but I could hear the tension in his words. "We didn't want to hurt you." "But you did," I whispered, feeling the pain of it all settle deep in my chest. "You all did." Richard stood up, trying to reach for my hand, but I pulled away. I couldn't let him touch me right now, not when everything felt broken. "Laura, I can explain," he began, but I shook my head, the tears I had been holding back finally spilling over. "No, Richard. You can't explain this. Not anymore." The tension in the air was suffocating, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I didn't know these people anymore. The family I had built, the family I had loved, was unraveling right before my eyes, and no one seemed to know how to stop it. Evelyn sat quietly at the cafe table, her hands wrapped around the warm coffee mug, her eyes tracing the steam rising from it. She had hoped this meeting would go differently. She had convinced herself it would go smoothly this time, that the years of separation and silence could be bridged with a few simple conversations. But it wasn't going to be that easy. Richard had looked so different when they first reconnected, after all these years. The years had softened the sharp edges of his youth, but there was still that spark in his eyes, that same warmth that had once drawn her in. She had missed him. They both had their lives, their families now, but that old connection had never quite faded, not entirely. She had been surprised when he called her. She had never expected him to reach out after all this time. But there he was, in the cafe, across from her, and it was like nothing had changed, not really. Except now, there was more. There were other people to consider, people who hadn't been there before. Chloe had known something was different the moment she started noticing the tension between Evelyn and Richard. Chloe had a sharp intuition, just like her mother had. She could tell that there was a history between them, something unresolved, something more than the casual coffee meetings they kept having. Evelyn didn't hide it well. She never did. Richard didn't either. But she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected Laura to show up that Sunday. The moment she saw her, standing in the doorway, her gaze locked onto them with that quiet fury only a wife could possess, Evelyn felt something inside of her twist. It wasn't guilt. Not entirely. But there was a pang of regret. Laura had always been so kind, so accepting. She had welcomed Evelyn back into their lives, never questioning the past or what had once been. But now, as Laura stood there, her eyes wide with hurt, Evelyn realized that no matter how hard they tried to keep their past buried, it was always going to come to light. And it had, in the worst possible way. The truth was, Evelyn had never fully let go of Richard. She had tried, of course. She had married someone else, built a life, had a child. But Richard had always been there, just beneath the surface, lurking in her thoughts. And when he had called, it had felt like fate, like a chance to rewrite the story they had never finished. But they weren't the only ones who had been affected by their past. She looked at Daniel, sitting quietly at the table with them, his face tense with the same confusion that had crept into her own heart. He was a reminder of everything she had once wanted but never had. A reminder of the choices they had made, of the paths they had taken. Laura doesn't understand, she thought, her gaze still lingering on the woman who stood so rigidly at the doorway. She never will. How could she? How could anyone understand the bond Richard and I shared? But even as the words played through her mind, Evelyn knew she had made mistakes. She had allowed herself to slip back into that old rhythm with Richard, allowing their connection to deepen again in ways she hadn't planned for. She had never meant for Daniel to be part of it. She hadn't planned for Chloe to get caught in the middle. But somehow it had all collided, past and present blending into something she couldn't control. She glanced at Richard, who was staring at the table now, unable to look up at his wife. Evelyn knew he was torn. He didn't want to hurt Laura, but he couldn't ignore the past either. She had seen it in his eyes, the same longing that mirrored her own. But this wasn't the time. She knew that. They had crossed a line, and there was no easy way to undo it. Everything had changed the moment Daniel had stepped into the picture. He had been so young when she first met him. So innocent. Now, as he sat there with Chloe, a connection that had always been unspoken began to surface. She could see it now, the way he looked at her daughter, the way their hands brushed so casually. It wasn't just a fling. It wasn't something they could laugh off. They were in deep. Evelyn sighed, running a finger along the rim of her coffee cup. What had they done? What had they really expected to happen? The past, buried and forgotten, had resurfaced in the most painful way. The worst part was that she couldn't undo it. The more they tried to bury the truth, the more it seemed to rise to the surface. She turned her gaze to Chloe, her daughter, who had been looking at her with questioning eyes. Chloe had always been perceptive. She had noticed the tension in her mother's voice, the subtle shifts in the way Richard and Evelyn interacted. She hadn't said anything, but Evelyn knew. Chloe had been caught in the middle of all of this, and Evelyn hated that. She had never meant for her daughter to get involved in this twisted web. But it had happened anyway. "I never wanted any of this," Evelyn whispered to herself, though the words barely escaped her lips. "I never wanted to hurt anyone." She glanced back at the scene unfolding before her, and for the first time in a long while, Evelyn wondered if it was too late to fix everything. Could they untangle the mess they had made? Could they go back to where they had started, before the lies, before the secrets, before all of this? But deep down, she already knew the answer. No, they couldn't. Chloe sat at the cafe table, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her cup as the conversation around her seemed to blur into the background. She wasn't really hearing what was being said. The words didn't make sense anymore. Everything felt distorted, like she was watching a movie she hadn't signed up for, a movie where she didn't belong, but there she was, a part of it nonetheless. She had known something was off the moment she saw her mother and Richard together, sitting side by side, as if the years hadn't passed, as if the distance between them hadn't existed. It wasn't the same, though. The air between them had changed. It wasn't just the nostalgia of old friends reconnecting. There was an undercurrent of something deeper, something unspoken, but palpable. And it scared Chloe more than she was willing to admit. She hadn't been prepared for this. For the way Richard looked at her mother or the way their conversations, their glances, seemed to linger just a little too long. It wasn't just a reunion, it was something more. Something that didn't belong in the present. But it wasn't until Daniel came into the picture that the true depth of the situation hit her. She hadn't meant for it to happen. She hadn't planned on falling for him. Daniel was her mother's friend's son, someone she had known for most of her life. They had grown up together, shared birthday parties, family holidays. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. A glance, a touch, a conversation that lingered too long. And suddenly, Daniel wasn't just the boy she had known as a child. He was something else. Something she couldn't ignore. Now, sitting here in this quiet corner of the cafe, Chloe realized just how deep the mess had gone. She had gotten herself tangled in this web of family history and secrets, a history she hadn't been ready to confront. She had known her mother's connection to Richard, but she hadn't known what it truly meant. She hadn't understood the weight of it until now. Her thoughts were interrupted when Daniel shifted in his seat, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. The connection between them was undeniable. It was more than just attraction. It was a bond that neither of them had fully acknowledged, but it had always been there, lurking just beneath the surface. Chloe could feel her heart racing as she looked at him. What was happening? What was she supposed to do? She had never been in a situation like this before. She had never had to question everything she thought she knew about family, love, and loyalty. She turned her gaze back to Richard and Evelyn. The older couple was sitting there, a few feet away, lost in their own world, but the tension between them was impossible to miss. Chloe could see the guilt in her mother's eyes, the hesitation in Richard's movements. They were both caught up in something they couldn't undo, something that had started long before Chloe was born. And now she was in the middle of it all, caught between the past and the present, between family and forbidden love. Chloe had always admired her mother's strength, her ability to hold everything together, even when it seemed like the world was falling apart. But now, as she watched Evelyn's face twist with emotions Chloe didn't quite understand, she realized her mother was just as lost as she was. Maybe more so. Evelyn had never fully let go of Richard. And now Chloe had to wonder if her mother's unresolved feelings for him were going to be the thing that destroyed everything they had. She swallowed hard. What was the right thing to do? Should she distance herself from Daniel? Should she confront her mother about everything? Could she even do that without breaking something inside herself? The guilt weighed heavily on her chest, pressing down on her with each breath she took. And then there was the other truth she hadn't fully allowed herself to face. What if she couldn't let go of Daniel? What if she wanted to be with him, despite the complications, despite the history, despite everything that was wrong about it? She glanced at him again, and this time, their eyes locked for longer. Daniel's face was unreadable, but she could see the conflict there too. He was torn. He had his family to consider. He had his mother and father, and now everything was falling apart. The last thing he needed was for his feelings to make things worse. Chloe wasn't sure who she was hurting more, her mother or herself. She wasn't sure who had the right to feel betrayed, who had the right to make demands. The roles had blurred. What was family? What was loyalty? And what was love? She had never imagined she'd be in a situation like this. Never thought she'd be the one to make the choice between her family and her heart. She thought love would be easier, simpler. But now, everything felt like a tangled mess she couldn't escape from. Her fingers tightened around the cup, her thoughts swirling like the steam rising from it. Maybe there was no right answer. Maybe the only thing she could do was follow her heart, wherever it might lead, whether that meant facing the consequences of loving Daniel or letting him go for good. But deep down, Chloe knew she wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. The air in the house had become suffocating, heavy with the unspoken words, the accusations, the silence that filled every room. After that Sunday at the cafe, things had only gotten worse. Richard and Laura barely spoke, and when they did, it was terse, strained, like two strangers trying to remember how to share space. Daniel and Chloe were no better. It was like the whole family had fractured into pieces, and no one knew how to put it back together. The tension was unbearable, and Evelyn knew it couldn't go on like this. There were only so many sleepless nights, so many dinners eaten in silence, before the cracks would break everything apart. The secrets, the lies, the guilt, it was all consuming. And there was no one left to turn to, no one to make sense of the mess they had created. That's when she suggested it. Not to Richard, but to herself first. Counseling. Maybe it was the last thing they needed, but it was the only thing that had a chance of saving them now. She wasn't sure where to start. She had never been a fan of therapy or sitting down with a stranger to talk about her problems. But something had shifted in her. She realized that the emotional weight she had been carrying for years had become too much to bear alone. She needed someone who could help her understand what was happening, not just to her, but to the entire family. She made the call the next day, arranging for an appointment with a family therapist who came highly recommended. The idea of talking to someone about everything that had happened seemed overwhelming, but it also felt like the only possible way forward. She didn't know if it would work, but it was worth a shot. At first, she wasn't sure how she was going to get Richard to agree to come. He had always been a man who preferred to handle things privately, to keep his emotions hidden. He wasn't one to lay everything bare in front of a stranger. But when Evelyn mentioned counseling, he didn't fight it like she thought he might. Instead, he just stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. It was as if he was searching for a way out, some excuse not to go. But there was no excuse. Not anymore. "If it'll help," Richard said quietly, the words coming out almost as an afterthought. "I'll go with you." She wasn't sure what to make of that. She didn't know if he was agreeing out of obligation or if he was actually willing to face everything that had been left unsaid. But Evelyn was desperate. Desperate to fix things, to understand why everything had gone so wrong, to see if there was any chance of salvaging what was left. The first session was awkward. They sat in a small, sterile office with soft lighting and a few uncomfortable chairs, each one of them trying to avoid looking at the other. Evelyn couldn't help but feel exposed, as though the therapist could see right through her, right to the core of everything she had been trying to bury. Richard sat beside her, rigid and tense, as if he was waiting for something to happen. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Martin, was kind but firm. She didn't waste any time, jumping right into the heart of the matter. She asked questions that made Evelyn squirm, questions that made her uncomfortable. How long had Richard and Evelyn been struggling? What were the underlying issues in their relationship? What had led to the breakdown? Evelyn didn't know where to start. There were so many things she had kept inside for so long, things she had never voiced to anyone. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding back until Dr. Martin started asking her to open up. Richard, for his part, was quiet. Too quiet. He barely spoke, offering only half-hearted responses when he was asked. Evelyn knew he wasn't ready to confront the truth, not yet. But there was a shift in the room, something subtle, something that told her he was thinking. Thinking about everything they had built and everything they had lost. It wasn't easy. Every question felt like a weight, a burden that threatened to crush her. And yet, as the session went on, she found herself saying things she hadn't planned on saying. Words that had been buried deep inside her for years, words she had never dared to speak. She told Dr. Martin about the years of tension in her marriage, the sense of growing distance between her and Richard. She talked about the unspoken pain, the lack of connection, and the creeping feeling that something was wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. She told her about the Sundays, about the betrayal she had felt when she followed Richard and saw him with Evelyn. And she told her about Daniel, the way his presence in her life had turned everything upside down. Richard stayed silent for most of it, only speaking when Dr. Martin turned to him directly. When asked how he felt about their relationship, he hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he said finally. "I don't know how we got here. But I want to try. I want to fix things." Evelyn wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he truly cared, that he was willing to fight for their family. But the words were empty, hollow. She wasn't sure if they meant anything at all. The sessions continued week after week, and with each one, Evelyn could feel the walls around her heart begin to crack. It was slow, painful work, pulling back the layers of resentment, disappointment, and confusion. But it was something. It was better than doing nothing, better than pretending everything was fine. Richard, however, seemed to be retreating further into himself. The more they spoke about the past, the more distant he became. It was as if the weight of their history was too much for him to carry. And Evelyn couldn't help but wonder if this was a battle they couldn't win. If maybe, after all these years, they were simply too far gone. But still, she kept going. She kept trying. For herself, for Richard, for the family they had once been. The days blurred into each other, each one marked by a fragile hope that things would get better. Evelyn sat in her living room one afternoon, staring out the window, watching the leaves flutter in the breeze. It was one of those quiet moments where the world outside seemed far removed from the turmoil inside her house. For the first time in weeks, she had a few moments to herself. No one was home. No one was talking. The silence was deafening. She thought about everything that had led her to this point. Her relationship with Richard, the years they had spent together, good and bad, happy and tense. There was so much history between them, so many shared memories that now felt tainted. The question that kept swirling in her mind was whether that history could ever be enough to keep them together. Could their past really sustain them, or was it the past that was slowly suffocating them? Richard's distance had become more pronounced in recent weeks. He hadn't opened up like she had hoped during counseling. He hadn't admitted to the things he was truly feeling, and Evelyn began to wonder if he even knew what he wanted anymore. She remembered their early years together, the passion, the fire that had once bound them. But that fire had long since turned to ashes. What they had now was nothing more than a flicker, struggling to stay alive in the face of everything they had neglected for so long. She turned her thoughts to Chloe. Her daughter had been through so much, more than any young woman should have to face. Chloe had been caught in the crossfire of Evelyn and Richard's strained relationship, and now, the fallout from her own involvement with Daniel had only added another layer of complexity. Evelyn couldn't help but wonder if she had failed her daughter. Had she unintentionally set her up for failure by making the same mistakes? By holding on to relationships that were already broken? Chloe had always been the strong one, the one who had kept everything together even when Evelyn couldn't. But lately, there was a sadness in her eyes, a sadness Evelyn hadn't seen before. Chloe was starting to question everything, just as Evelyn was. Was love worth it? Was loyalty worth it? And if it was, then why did everything feel so hollow? And then there was Daniel. Evelyn had always liked him, even before this whole mess had unfolded. He had been a good friend to Chloe, someone Evelyn could trust. But the truth was, Evelyn had never expected things to develop between him and her daughter. She had never expected the lines to blur between family and affection, but here they were. She could see the hurt in Chloe's eyes every time they spoke of him. It was clear that Chloe had feelings for Daniel, feelings that went beyond what was right. Evelyn had tried to ignore it, tried to pretend like it wasn't happening, but she couldn't anymore. What had once seemed like a harmless connection had now turned into something far more complicated. Chloe's feelings for Daniel were only a reflection of what had been missing in her life. She had always longed for a sense of stability, something that could fill the void her parents had left. But now, the very person who had always been there for her was the one she couldn't have. Evelyn found herself at a crossroads. She thought back to her own younger years, to when she and Richard had been in love and filled with the naive certainty that their love would last forever. But love, she had learned, wasn't always enough. Sometimes, it wasn't about the history you shared or the promises you made, it was about the present. And in the present, everything had changed. She could no longer ignore the fact that they were all drifting apart, all of them in different ways. Richard had become a ghost in their marriage, only half present, and, even then, only when it suited him. Chloe was distancing herself, as if to protect her heart from the inevitable disappointment she was sure would come. And Daniel, though quiet and respectful, couldn't hide the strain in his own eyes. He was just as trapped as the rest of them, bound by a history that wasn't his own. Evelyn wondered if she was the one who had been holding them all together for so long. If by trying to keep everything intact, she had unintentionally been keeping them stuck in something that couldn't work. She had been the glue, but now the glue was drying out, leaving cracks in its wake. She thought about Richard again, about their early days, about the promise of forever. Had that promise been enough to make up for all the years they had spent apart, for all the time they had lost? Or had they simply been holding onto the ghosts of who they used to be, trying to resurrect something that was long gone? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. She didn't need to check who it was. It was Chloe, coming home from another long day of work, a routine that seemed to repeat itself. never offering any new answers. Chloe stepped inside and stopped in her tracks when she saw her mother sitting in the living room, the same faraway look on her face that had become all too familiar. "Mom?" Chloe's voice broke through the silence. "You okay?" Evelyn didn't know how to answer. The truth was, she wasn't sure. She wasn't sure about anything anymore. About her marriage, about her daughter's future, or about what the next step would even be. All she knew was that something had to change. She could feel it in her bones. There was no turning back now. "Just thinking," Evelyn finally said, her voice soft but uncertain. "Thinking about everything." Chloe nodded slowly, her eyes meeting her mother's. There was an understanding there, one that spoke volumes without needing to be said aloud. Chloe knew the weight Evelyn was carrying. She knew that her mother was struggling, just as she was. And in that quiet moment, they both realized that maybe the most difficult part of it all wasn't the secrets or the lies. It was the uncertainty of what came next. How do you move forward when the past has held you hostage for so long? How do you rebuild when everything you thought you knew has crumbled? The house was quiet, almost eerily so, as Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt like she truly had control over anything. The chaos of the past few weeks had left her reeling, unable to get a handle on her emotions, her relationships, or even her own thoughts. It was time for a change. Time to stop letting things spiral further. She knew it now. She had to start setting boundaries. Not just for herself, but for everyone around her. She couldn't keep letting the lines blur between what was acceptable and what wasn't. The situation with Richard and Chloe had become too toxic, too entangled in secrets and guilt. It had been difficult to admit, but she realized she had allowed too many things to happen without taking a step back to reassess. Richard had grown distant, not just emotionally, but physically. His silence, his avoidance, had begun to feel like an unspoken agreement that neither of them would confront the issues between them. The more they avoided talking about it, the bigger the rift between them grew. And Chloe, caught in the crossfire, had been quietly drifting away, retreating into herself. She had become a reflection of the same patterns that had defined Evelyn and Richard's relationship for years, unable to speak up, unable to express her pain. Evelyn's mind kept replaying the moments when she felt like she had ignored the red flags, when she had allowed things to go unsaid for too long. She had allowed Richard to sidestep issues, convinced herself that things would eventually work themselves out. But now she understood that was never going to happen. She couldn't keep giving him the space to avoid the truth. And she couldn't keep allowing herself to live in the limbo between what was and what could have been. She looked at the clock on the wall and realized Richard would be home soon. They hadn't spoken much in the last few days, the tension between them thick enough to choke. But this time, Evelyn knew it couldn't go on. She couldn't wait any longer for him to come to her. She had to be the one to draw the line. When Richard entered the kitchen, he paused as he saw Evelyn sitting there, her posture rigid and her expression one of quiet determination. There was a subtle shift in the room, as if he sensed that this conversation was different from all the others they had avoided. He said nothing, but the weight of his presence seemed to fill the space. "Richard," Evelyn began, her voice steady but firm, "we need to talk." He didn't sit. He didn't move closer. He just stood there, waiting for her to say more. "I can't do this anymore," she continued, her eyes meeting his. "I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. We're not okay, and I need you to acknowledge that. I need you to stop avoiding this." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but she raised her hand, signaling for him to listen. "I've been quiet for too long," Evelyn went on. "I've let things slide, let you slide, because I thought that if I just held it together, everything would be okay. But it's not. You've distanced yourself from me, from this family. You've distanced yourself from the truth. And I can't keep living like this." There was a brief silence, then Richard shifted his weight, crossing his arms defensively. "I didn't know what you wanted me to do," Evelyn, he muttered. I've tried, but nothing changes. What do you want from me? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Evelyn didn't back down. She had made up her mind. This wasn't about trying to fix everything in one conversation. It was about setting the boundaries that should have been in place from the start. She had spent years ignoring what was clearly wrong, letting the small things pile up until they became unmanageable. I want respect, she said, her voice unwavering. I want transparency. I need you to acknowledge the damage that's been done, to stop avoiding the things we need to face. And if you can't do that, if you can't be honest with me, with yourself, then I can't keep doing this. His expression flickered. For a moment, she saw something in his eyes, something like regret, maybe fear, but it was fleeting. He opened his mouth again, but this time, Evelyn wasn't waiting for him to speak. She had already said what she needed to say. I don't know what will happen between us, she continued, but I do know that I deserve more than what you're offering right now. I'm not going to stay in a relationship where I feel invisible. And I won't let my daughter grow up believing this is what love looks like. There was a long pause, and Evelyn could feel the air between them thickening, the weight of her words sinking in. Richard stood there, the fight slowly draining from him as he processed what she had said. For the first time in a long while, Evelyn felt a strange sense of empowerment. It wasn't about having all the answers, it was about drawing a line. She could no longer let the uncertainty dictate the course of her life. Richard finally spoke, his voice low, almost resigned. I don't know what you want me to say, Evelyn. I don't know how to fix this. Evelyn's heart ached as she looked at him. She had heard the words, but they didn't comfort her. They only confirmed what she had feared. He didn't know how to fix it, and maybe he never would. And that realization, that Richard wasn't the person she had hoped he would be, was the hardest truth she had to face. I don't need you to fix it, she replied softly. I need you to take responsibility, to make a choice. And I need you to respect the choices I make moving forward. Richard didn't answer. He stood there, still and silent, as Evelyn felt the weight of the moment settle over her. She had said what she needed to say, and now it was up to him to decide if he could meet her halfway. She wasn't going to beg for something that no longer felt real. She wasn't going to let herself stay in the shadows of a relationship that had lost its foundation. As he finally walked out of the kitchen, Evelyn sat back in her chair, her thoughts racing. She had set a boundary, but now the real challenge would be sticking to it. The hardest part wasn't saying it, it was following through. She couldn't go back to the way things were. It wasn't about punishing Richard or forcing him to change. It was about making sure she didn't lose herself in the process. It was about choosing herself, finally. The tension between Chloe and Daniel had been building for days. What had started as a friendship, an innocent connection based on mutual respect and understanding, had spiraled into something neither of them had expected. The more they tried to ignore it, the more obvious it became that their feelings for each other had crossed a line. But neither Chloe nor Daniel had been ready to confront the full weight of it. It wasn't just the secrecy that hung over them, it was the uncertainty. The guilt. The fact that they were both stuck in a situation that no one could have predicted. Chloe's thoughts constantly swirled, a whirlwind of emotions she didn't know how to navigate. She had always been careful, cautious with her heart, but with Daniel, everything felt different. She could no longer pretend that the connection between them was insignificant. The days since their kiss had been nothing short of torturous. Chloe could barely focus at work, couldn't sleep without replaying every moment in her mind. Every time she saw Daniel, her heart beat faster, but there was a nagging sense of wrongness that lingered. She had always prided herself on being the level-headed one, the responsible daughter who had always done the right thing. But now, she felt like a stranger to herself. What was the right thing anymore? Daniel, too, was struggling. He had always admired Chloe, her strength, her intelligence, her independence. But after that kiss, everything had changed. He couldn't deny that he had feelings for her, feelings that were more than just friendship. But the reality of their situation was hard to ignore. The knowledge that Evelyn was his best friend's wife and that Chloe was his best friend's daughter was a burden neither of them could escape. Every time he looked at Chloe, he saw the forbidden, the dangerous allure of something that was never meant to happen. And yet, every time he saw her, it felt impossible to stay away. They had tried to distance themselves, tried to put the pieces of their lives back into their neatly planned places. But they couldn't. Not anymore. It wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. It was something real. Something undeniable. The decision came late one evening, after weeks of quiet contemplation. Daniel had invited Chloe over under the pretense of needing to talk, but both of them knew it wasn't just about a conversation. They had reached a point where pretending nothing was happening wasn't an option. They needed to face the truth. Chloe entered Daniel's apartment and found him standing by the window, his back to her, his posture tense. He had always been good at hiding his emotions, but tonight his shoulders were tight, his usual calm demeanor nowhere to be found. "Daniel," Chloe said softly, walking toward him. Her voice was hesitant, unsure. "We need to talk." He turned around to face her, his eyes meeting hers. There was something different in them now, something raw, something vulnerable. "I know," he replied, his voice low. "I've been thinking about this for days, Chloe." "About us?" Chloe nodded, her throat tight. She didn't know what she expected him to say, but it wasn't the intensity in his gaze, the way he seemed to be searching her for something she wasn't sure she could give him. She had never felt more torn in her life. "Do you think we can just walk away from this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Pretend it didn't happen?" Daniel looked down for a moment, his jaw tightening. He shook his head slowly. "I don't think we can, Chloe. Not after what's happened. Not after everything we've felt. It's not something I can just ignore. And I don't think you can either." Chloe swallowed hard, trying to hold herself together. The guilt was suffocating, but so was the pull between them. She had spent years telling herself that she was doing everything right, that she had her life together. But this was something she hadn't prepared for. This was messy, complicated, and dangerous. But it also felt real. It felt impossible to deny. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "This feels so wrong, but at the same time, I can't ignore what I'm feeling. And I don't think you can either." Daniel stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers, his fingers brushing against hers lightly, almost tentatively. His touch sent a jolt through her, a reminder of how real this was. "Chloe, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if we can make this work, but I can't pretend like I don't care about you. I've been trying to ignore it, but I can't. I just can't." Chloe's heart was racing. She wanted to pull away, to tell him this wasn't right, that they couldn't keep doing this. But at the same time, she didn't want to let go. She didn't want to turn her back on the one person who made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this," she confessed, her voice shaking. "What if we make everything worse? What if we ruin everything?" Daniel's eyes softened, his hand gently squeezing hers. "I don't know what's going to happen, Chloe. But I do know that I want to try. I want to be honest with you. And I want us to figure this out together, even if it's hard." Chloe closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. She had always been someone who needed to think things through, who needed to know the outcome before she took a leap. But this wasn't about knowing what would happen next. It was about making a choice. And for the first time in a long time, Chloe realized that she couldn't live in fear of the consequences. She had to make the decision for herself, without worrying about the fallout. "I don't know what this means, Daniel," she said softly, "but I want to figure it out too. I can't keep pretending like nothing's happening. But we need to be careful. We need to think about everything before we make any more decisions." Daniel nodded, his expression serious but hopeful. "I agree. But whatever happens, we'll figure it out together. No matter how complicated it gets." Chloe looked at him, her heart heavy but her resolve firm. She didn't know where this would lead, or if it would lead anywhere at all. But she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't keep pretending anymore. She had to face the reality of what was happening between them, no matter how messy or painful it might be. The weeks following the revelation of Chloe and Daniel's decision were filled with quiet moments of self-reflection and change. It wasn't easy. It never was. But Evelyn, despite the pain and betrayal she had endured, had begun the slow, difficult process of healing. She could feel the fractures in her heart, the weight of the past pressing down on her. But there was also something new. A flicker of strength she hadn't known was there. Each morning, she woke up a little bit more determined. Each day, she took small steps toward reclaiming the parts of herself she had lost. The nights were still long, and sometimes the silence of the house was overwhelming, but there was a quiet resolve in Evelyn now that hadn't existed before. She was learning to breathe again, to live for herself. The first time she truly felt a sense of progress was when she started spending more time with Chloe. At first, it had felt impossible to look at her daughter without the raw sting of betrayal. But as days turned into weeks, Evelyn found that it wasn't Chloe she was angry with, it was the situation, the broken promises, the lies. She knew Chloe hadn't meant to hurt her. She was just as lost as everyone else. Chloe had been just as broken by the events that had transpired. She had never intended for things to unfold the way they had. She had always been close to her mother, but after everything, their relationship had become strained. The guilt weighed heavily on her. But as time went on, Chloe began to realize that her mother needed her now more than ever. Slowly, their conversations shifted from awkward, uncomfortable exchanges to moments of understanding, where both of them could speak their truths without judgment. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And Daniel, well, Daniel was another story. Their relationship had been fractured, and there was no denying that. He had tried to reach out, but Evelyn wasn't ready. She wasn't sure if she ever would be. But something had shifted within her, and it was clear that she wasn't going to let him control her emotions anymore. The anger that once burned through her had started to dull. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was acceptance. She couldn't hold onto the resentment forever. She couldn't let it consume her. The first real breakthrough came when Evelyn decided to go back to work. It wasn't a huge step, but it was a step. She found herself immersed in the daily grind once again, interacting with people who hadn't witnessed the collapse of her personal life. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of purpose that didn't revolve around her broken marriage or fractured family. Her coworkers, kind and understanding, made sure to keep things light around her. They were aware of the situation, but they didn't ask questions. It was the space Evelyn needed to breathe, to feel like herself again. She wasn't just Richard's wife or Chloe's mother anymore. She was Evelyn, an individual with dreams and desires of her own. It was a powerful realization. And then there were the small victories. The moments when Evelyn would find herself laughing at a joke, or when she realized she hadn't thought about the past for an entire hour. Those moments were fleeting, but they added up. They began to outweigh the tears, the hurt, the anger. It wasn't perfect. The road to healing was full of twists and turns. There were days when Evelyn felt like she was taking 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. But it was progress. And that's what mattered. Chloe, too, had her own healing journey. Her relationship with Daniel was still in the process of being untangled, and she knew she had to confront the consequences of what had happened, not just with him, but with her family. But Chloe also realized that she couldn't keep apologizing for things that had already happened. She had to forgive herself before she could truly heal. She spent more time with her mother, helping to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. They talked about things they had never spoken of before, their fears, their hopes, the things that had been left unsaid for years. It was painful at times, but it was also necessary. Slowly, Chloe began to understand that she wasn't her mistakes. She wasn't defined by the mess that had come before. she could still move forward. And Daniel? Well, Daniel was still on his own journey. He had made mistakes, but he, too, was beginning to see the need for change. The guilt that had weighed on him for so long was something he couldn't ignore. He had to make amends, but he also had to learn to let go. Let go of the past, of the shame, of the choices that had led him to this point. It wasn't about fixing everything. It was about growing, evolving, and understanding that healing took time. As Evelyn, Chloe, and Daniel each navigated their own paths, they began to see that moving forward wasn't about erasing the past. It wasn't about pretending things had never happened. It was about learning from it, accepting it, and finding the strength to build something new, something better. Evelyn's heart wasn't completely healed yet, but she had started to embrace the idea that it might one day be. She wasn't defined by her husband's betrayal or her daughter's mistakes. She was defined by her ability to rise above them. Every day was a new opportunity to reclaim her life, her peace, and her happiness. And as she continued on this journey, she knew she was stronger than she had ever been before. The invitation had come from Evelyn, though Chloe knew it wasn't something she had planned easily. The idea of bringing the family together again after everything that had happened felt overwhelming. But Evelyn had insisted. "We need to find a way back to normal," she'd said. The words still echoed in Chloe's mind as she prepared for the gathering. It had been weeks since the last time they had all sat together as a family, but the tension that hung in the air was impossible to ignore. The last few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, and now they were all supposed to sit around a table, share a meal, and pretend that everything was fine. Chloe couldn't help but feel a knot of anxiety twist in her stomach. How could they act like everything was okay when so much had changed? As Chloe arrived at her mother's house, she couldn't help but notice how different it all felt. The familiar scent of home-cooked meals and freshly baked bread lingered in the air, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something new. It wasn't just the people who had changed. The space itself felt altered, as though the walls had absorbed the tension and heartbreak of the last few months. Evelyn was in the kitchen arranging the food on the table, her hands moving with practiced ease, though her eyes betrayed the exhaustion she was feeling. There was no denying that she had changed, too. The woman who had once been consumed by the image of the perfect family, always striving to keep things in order, now appeared more grounded, more real. There was a quiet strength in her that had grown from the pain she had endured. "Chloe, darling," Evelyn said softly as she turned around, offering a small smile. "I'm glad you're here." Chloe returned the smile, though it felt strained. She had come for her mother, for the hope of healing, but the thought of facing Daniel again, of seeing him sitting across from her at the table, was difficult to shake. Daniel, as expected, had already arrived. He was sitting in the living room, his eyes on the ground when Chloe walked in. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment, Chloe could see the weight of regret in his expression, but there was something else too, something unspoken, perhaps a quiet plea for understanding. Chloe quickly averted her gaze, focusing on her mother instead. The silence in the room felt suffocating at first, and Chloe could hear the sound of her own heartbeat as she nervously adjusted her clothes. Would they all be able to talk? Could they act as though nothing had happened, as though they weren't all standing on the edge of a precipice, ready to fall? The idea of small talk seemed impossible, but Chloe knew they needed to try. Evelyn's voice broke the silence as she motioned to the table. "Everyone, please sit. The food is ready." Slowly, they all gathered around the table. The clinking of plates, the passing of dishes, the rustling of napkins, it all seemed so normal, so mundane. But beneath it, there was a tension that nobody could ignore. Evelyn caught Daniel's eye briefly, and there was a flicker of something there, something between them that neither of them knew how to acknowledge. Chloe noticed it, too, and felt a lump form in her throat. She couldn't help but wonder if things would ever go back to how they had been before. Could they all sit together as a family again, or would this moment always be clouded by the weight of the secrets that had come to light? The conversation began awkwardly, with Evelyn asking Chloe how her work was going. Daniel remained quiet, his gaze flickering between Chloe and Evelyn as he picked at his food. He seemed almost lost in the moment, as if he didn't know how to fit into this new version of their family. It wasn't until the laughter of a distant relative broke the tension that things started to shift. Slowly, they began to talk about trivial things, small talk that didn't mean much, but it was enough to fill the silence. Chloe caught herself laughing along with her mother, and for a brief moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But then, her eyes met Daniel's again, and the reminder of everything that had happened came rushing back. It was like a wave, pulling her under, and she had to quickly push the thoughts aside. As the evening wore on, the conversation began to flow more naturally. They spoke about the weather, the news, and the upcoming holidays. But Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that they were all pretending. The family gathering, while necessary, had become a reminder of the fragility of their relationships. Everyone was trying, but the pieces didn't fit the same way they once had. Evelyn, however, seemed determined to make the best of it. Her voice was steady, and she led the conversation with purpose, focusing on the present, not the past. Chloe could see her mother's efforts to keep the family together, to keep things from falling apart. But she also saw the sadness in her eyes, the quiet acknowledgement that they weren't truly whole anymore. At one point, Daniel stood up to help clear the table, his movements careful, as if trying to avoid stepping on any emotional landmines. Chloe watched him, her stomach in knots. She wondered how long they could keep up the facade. How long could they all pretend that things weren't broken, that they could simply move on without addressing the underlying issues? The evening ended with a few awkward goodbyes. Daniel, ever the gentleman, said goodbye to Evelyn first, giving her a brief, tight hug. He didn't look at Chloe as he left. Chloe didn't know if that was a relief or if it made her heart ache more. As the door clicked shut behind him, Evelyn sighed softly, running a hand through her hair. "Well," Evelyn said quietly, as if speaking to herself more than anyone else. "That went better than I expected." Chloe didn't respond immediately. She felt the weight of the night's events settling over her like a heavy cloak. There had been no explosive arguments, no outbursts. But there had been no healing either. Not yet. It was a start, though. That much, at least, was clear. But the road to repair was long, and Chloe wasn't sure where it would take them. As the days turned into weeks, there was a subtle shift in the air, a change that was slow, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable all the same. The weight of the past still hung heavy in the corners of their lives, but it wasn't as suffocating as it had been. It was as if, little by little, the family was starting to understand what it meant to move forward. Not forgetting the pain or pretending it hadn't happened, but accepting it, integrating it into who they were now, and learning how to exist beyond it. Evelyn had always been the pillar of her family, the one who kept everything together. But in the months following the unraveling of everything she had thought was stable, she realized that she needed to be something else. She needed to be whole for herself, not just for Chloe or Daniel or anyone else. It was a lesson that came slowly, as she took time for herself in ways she hadn't before. She spent weekends in the quiet of her own company, taking long walks in the park, reading books that had long been neglected, and finding peace in the stillness. She even started to take on small creative projects around the house, things she had never made time for in the past. It was during one of these walks, when the sun was setting and casting long shadows on the pavement, that Evelyn first realized she could be happy again. The thought had always seemed impossible, buried beneath layers of grief and anger, but it began to surface. It wasn't about finding a new life or a new love. It was about rediscovering herself, the woman she had once been before all the heartbreak, before everything had become tangled in secrets. Evelyn began to embrace that woman again, little by little, allowing herself to breathe without the suffocating pressure of the past. Chloe, too, found herself embarking on her own journey of self-discovery. After everything that had happened, she knew she needed to change, to find a version of herself that wasn't bound by the mistakes she had made. She had spent so much of her life focused on other people's needs, her family, her friends, her relationships, that she had forgotten how to focus on her own. She started making time for herself, doing things that brought her joy, painting, traveling, meeting new people. She even began to take up yoga, finding that the quiet moments of stretching and breathing gave her a sense of peace she hadn't known she needed. Her relationship with Daniel remained strained, but Chloe had learned something important in the time they had spent apart. She had learned that forgiveness wasn't about letting someone off the hook. It was about releasing the hold that anger and resentment had on her. She couldn't change the past, but she could change how it affected her. The road to forgiveness wasn't easy, but Chloe began to find her way through it, slowly, cautiously. And in that process, she began to rebuild the trust with her mother that had been so deeply shattered. Daniel, on his own journey, was learning how to be better, how to be different. He had come to realize that it wasn't enough to just apologize, to say the words. It wasn't enough to expect everything to go back to normal simply because he was sorry. He had to prove his sincerity, to show that he was committed to change, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. He started going to therapy, something he had resisted at first. But as he sat in those sessions, confronting his own demons and reflecting on his mistakes, something began to shift inside him. It was painful, at times unbearable, but it was necessary. The guilt that had weighed on him for so long was starting to lose its grip, not because it wasn't deserved, but because he was learning how to live with it, how to grow beyond it. He also made an effort to reconnect with Chloe and Evelyn in small, meaningful ways. It wasn't about fixing everything overnight, but rather about rebuilding the foundation of their relationships. He had long learned that love wasn't just about grand gestures, it was about consistency, showing up day after day, even when things weren't easy. It was about doing the work, even when it seemed impossible. In the months that followed, the family began to find a new rhythm. It wasn't the same as before, of course it wasn't, but there was a sense of peace in the way they moved through their days. Chloe and Evelyn spent more time together, sharing moments of laughter and vulnerability, things that had been missing for so long. Their conversations became deeper, more authentic. They began to talk about the future, about the dreams they had put on hold. For the first time in a long while, Evelyn allowed herself to dream again. She thought about the possibility of traveling, seeing the world in a way she never had before. Maybe one day she would take a trip to Paris or spend a summer in the mountains. She didn't know exactly what that future looked like, but she could see the outline of it, a future where she wasn't weighed down by the past, a future that was hers to shape. As for Chloe, she started to look at her own future differently. She realized she didn't have to follow the same path as her parents or live up to the same expectations. She could carve out her own place in the world, free from the shadows of her past mistakes. The idea of love, of family, had become complicated for her, but she also understood that she could learn to define it on her own terms. Maybe she wasn't ready for another relationship just yet, but she was learning how to love herself, and that, she realized, was the most important first step. And Daniel, for all the pain and regret that had come from his actions, was beginning to understand that forgiveness wasn't just about the others, it was about forgiving himself. It was about acknowledging that he wasn't perfect, that he had made mistakes, but that he had the power to become a better person moving forward. His journey wasn't complete, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. The family's new beginning wasn't perfect. It wasn't without its struggles, its moments of doubt and fear. But it was real, and it was theirs. And in that, there was hope. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building something new from the pieces of what was left. As time passed, the family slowly found a way to heal, piece by piece. It wasn't an easy journey, and the scars of the past would always remain, But the process of growth, forgiveness, and self-discovery paved the way for a new beginning. Chloe, Daniel, and Evelyn each learned valuable lessons about themselves and each other, lessons about love, trust, and the power of second chances. Their story reminds us that even in the most difficult of circumstances, there's always hope for change. And while the road to healing may be long, it's the willingness to take those first steps that matters the most. Life is full of twists and turns, but with patience and understanding, we can rebuild what was once broken. If you found this story meaningful or relatable, make sure to give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more emotional, real-life stories that touch your heart. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.